Hey friends, my name's Rich Birch. Welcome to this summary presentation about the 2024 National Executive Pastors Survey. We're going to go through some key insights that we hope might help shape your church for this year. This is the fifth year that we've done this survey. We do it every year in December deliberately because we're trying to catch a pulse, really, as we turn from one year to the next. We have hundreds of executive pastors every year who help us with this. And it really gives us a sense of what's happening in the church. We've been able to track some trends over this year. And so what we want to do is give you some insights that you can apply to your church, not just kind of what's happening in the church in general, but hopefully some things that might help you as you think and wrestle through these issues. At Unseminary, we love executive pastors. That's where my background is, in that second chair, really leading at the intersection of vision and execution. That's where we lead, and we're just so honored that you would take some time to listen to this presentation and to think about and reflect on where things are at in your church. So let's dive in with some insights for this year. So the first one, I would say this is a big insight. Hybrid worship is here to stay. 86.18% of churches offer both in-person and online. This is up from 79% last year, and those churches that are offering just online only are less than 1% and shrinking. This is an interesting insight. Listen, last year, 2024, there were many kind of high-profile churches. Many's too strong of a word. There were a few high-profile churches that made a big deal about the fact that they were getting out of church online. We're not doing online anymore. And I was saying at the time, don't do it, friends. That is bad thinking. It was interesting over the course of this thing, as we've been doing this survey. I remember early in 2020, there were a whole group of churches and leaders that were kind of on the opposite end of the spectrum. They were saying, we're going all in. We're never going back to in-person worship. It's going to be online all the time. And I was like, raised my hand. I was like, I don't think that's true. We've had 2,000 years of in-person services. I think there is something about the gathered body of Christ. Please, we are going to get back into in-person. But then now it's like the pendulum swung the other way and people are like, we're getting rid of the online stuff. Friends, what we're seeing is that is just not the case with the majority of churches out there. Church going forward is hybrid, is both online and in person. We know that a high percentage, 90 some odd percent of the guests that arrive at your church are going to check you out online, on your church online experience, on YouTube, on social media. This is important. So you need to build a screen to seat assimilation process. Your website is the beginning of the assimilation process. What you're doing on your app to engage people during the week is a critical piece of this puzzle. So you're going to want to be thinking about this as we go forward. We really want you also to be thinking about the fact that you can use your online tools, not just to invite your people to, come to in-person service, but actually call out the fact that, hey, you know what a great thing you could do out of today? If you've been impacted by today's message, why not invite your people to share that message, or the clips, or YouTube stuff, or TikTok, to share that with their friends. We want to really invest in both online and in-person experiences that really maintain consistency and excellence. It should feel like your church's experience when you're coming online. And it doesn't bother me, and this is a strategy question really, but it doesn't bother me if there are things that we're doing in our in-person experiences that we can't replicate online, because our pathway is about screen to seat. We are hoping to drive people from online and ultimately getting them to come in person. That's a part of what we're doing. So if you're thinking about getting rid of online, please do not do that. I know a few churches did that last year, and I've commented about that in other contexts. But what this clearly shows is that people are doing both, and we're not going back. Hybrid church is here to stay. Number 2, financial and spiritual health are improving. So 54% of churches report stronger financial health than in 2023. This is great to say. This is great to see. And 57% of churches said they had higher spiritual vitality. This is fantastic. Churches across the country are showing both resilience and recovery after the pandemic. You'll see me say this a few times. I think about this every year. We do this survey because we started this kind of in the teeth of the pandemic. And really what we're showing is that both financial and spiritual vitality are continued to improve. Just today I was talking to a church, one of the churches that I coach, and they saw a huge growth year this last year. Put them in probably one of the fastest growing churches in the country, and their financial health is tracking with their attendance. There is this notion that you cannot do both, that you cannot grow and grow your finances at the same time. You can't reach people, unchurched people, and see finances grow. That's just not true. Really what we want to do is help you focus on impact stories week in, week out, every weekend in your offering. Please don't do like offering talks that you can download online or use ChatGPT to generate. You should be sharing genuine stories, pictures of things happening at your events, and drawing the connection between life change and the finances of your church. When people give to your church, good things happen. Share that week in, week out. There's momentum that's happening at your church. And this is great to see. If you're one of these churches that reported both improved finances and improved spiritual vitality, I would say 2025 is the year for you to double down and take some risk. Let's do some stuff that we haven't done before. Let's put some of that capital in risk. Let's invest it. Put it out into back into the harvest to see what we can do to see more people get connected with the message of Jesus. All right. So that's insight number 2. Insight number 3, leadership development, tops staff care priorities. Let me move this so you can see this here. So this is interesting. Leadership development was the number 1 priority by 36, almost 37% of responded, and it was in the top 2 priorities of 59% of all the churches that were studied. Mental health consistently ranked the lowest in these, and 56% of churches ranked it in the lowest of all of these categories. So what does this mean? Prioritizing leadership development is really a need for all of our churches. And you know this, Ephesians 4, we've got to be equipping, obviously, the people in our church, but that means that we've got to equip leaders in our, that are on our staff. We need our staff to be not just pastors, but also to be excellent leaders. In fact, we run a private coaching group for a group of churches called the Church Growth Incubator. And actually this month in Church Growth Incubator, we're doing some research on exactly this, specifically asking the question of fast-growing churches, what are they doing at the pivot of moving volunteers from being just a volunteer, obviously say that with air quotes, from just a volunteer to being a volunteer leader, and what are they doing? And what we're seeing, what's interesting in that research is as we're seeing them do this kind of research, or as we're doing this research, we're seeing that there's a strong correlation between churches that have a robust way of moving volunteers into leadership positions, that they also have a robust way of moving volunteer staff or volunteer leaders into paid staff applications, and into their, roles as on their team. These are connected. If you want to grow your staff, you're going to need to grow volunteers, really looking for providing structured growth opportunities for your staff this year. Something as easy as getting your staff team together and saying, we're going to read a book together in the next 3 months, even something as simple as that, and saying, hey, let's read this book. And in 3 months, we're going to have a discussion about it. I'm going to take you out for lunch. We're going to talk about it. Even that alone. Now, I do want to flag the mental health issue. This is an issue. I know that lots of our churches are not looking for this or not saying, hey, this is a priority, but I would continue to be thinking about these issues. Even if it's in the back of our mind, particularly as it relates to our next insight number 4, staff morale is rising, but burnout persists. Staff morale is rising, but burnout persists. So here's what the results were. 76.64% of staff, when we asked what their kind of orientation of the future, what we thought their orientation about the future was, hey, they were feeling hopeful about the future. But 29% said that they reported that they thought their staff were were burnt out or that exhaustion was like a real issue. So this is a good thing. I would say this is like a good news, bad news situation. Hope is rising among our church staff, which is positive. It's good to see, particularly when we pull back. You'll see this later when we pull back over the years. This is one of those areas that we've seen grow, which is positive. But burnout is real, friends. And that 29% of leaders who said when they kind of talked about how they described their staff, they would describe them as exhausted. These are two dynamics that both can be true at one time in your team. They can both feel hopeful for the future and frankly burnt out. They can feel excited about where the mission is for your church while at the same time exhausted personally. My recommendation for you is to read Carey Nieuwhof's stuff. Man, he does so much. His book, At Your Best, if you're looking for a resource for your team, do the staff training thing we just talked about. Read a book. We're going to read about it in over 3 months, and then we're going to get together and talk about it. Read his At Your Best book, and then have a conversation about green zones, yellow zones, red zones. None of that will make sense if you have not read his book, to help your team understand how can they avoid exhaustion? What do they need to do to manage their energy? Another thing is to provide practical tools. We don't want your team to overwork. We want them to work appropriately. And I know for me, in my context, when I was an executive pastor or leading teams, and we would talk about, like, because the problem is like staff time, it's like bottomless. How the mission is endless by definition. We've cast our mission in giant ways. And so our team will just keep working. And so what I would do is explain to our staff, if you think about the week, if you think about it, any given day, you've got the kind of lunch, or you got the breakfast to lunch. I would call that a block. And then you've got the lunch to dinner. That's a block. And then I've got dinner to whenever, bedtime. That's another block. And what I would encourage my staff, rather than thinking about hours of time, I would ask them to apply 10 blocks of effort every single week in, week out. So if you work, the first 2 days of the week, you work, morning till night, that's 6 blocks, so that you need to be taking other time off. Now, you don't need to necessarily do that for your team, but you need to have some sort of easy way to communicate something like that to your team to push back against burnout. Burnout is real, friends. Your people can be both committed to the mission and exhausted at the same time. If they're exhausted, that doesn't mean that they don't love the mission. It doesn't mean that they're not hopeful for the future. It just means they're tired. How can you help them build in rhythms of rest and celebration to sustain your team's morale? Something for you to think about. All right, insight number 5, volunteer engagement is a growth area. So in 2020, only 21% of churches reported that they were seeing volunteer growth in their communities, where across the board, we're seeing churches saying that volunteer growth is happening in our churches, which is wonderful. There's lots of different places actually throughout this survey that pointed towards that. Volunteer pipelines are being built. People are figuring out how to get volunteers plugged in at their church, which is fantastic. In fact, one of the things we've talked about in our coaching, I call it the 1-to-3 ratio of volunteer engagement, that for every one volunteer, it's a great party trick. If you were at a party of pastors, instead of asking, how big is your church? Ask them, how many volunteers do you have? And invariably, if you tell me the number of volunteers you have, I can tell you what your attendance is. If you say I've got 100 volunteers at my church, chances are your church is about 300. If you say I've got 1,000 volunteers, chances are your church of somewhere around 3,000 people. The 1-to-3 ratio is important because volunteer growth precedes attendance growth, not the other way around. So when we grow our teams, that is a way for us to really predict or to grow our overall attendance as a church. So volunteer growth precedes growth. So, what's the application here? If this isn't happening in your church, if you're not increasing volunteer engagement, providing a clear, meaningful volunteer roles to people, that's important to help them understand their gifts and their passions. That's a critical piece of the way. Provide clear ways for people to get plugged in a way that connects with who they are. Don't say no for them. Don't, this happens all the time. Too often, church leaders say no for their people. They go in and, they're like, oh, I can't ask somebody to do that. I can't ask somebody to do that. But what you understand though, is actually people with growing churches, have big asks of volunteers. Put a big ask out there. I remember a friend early on, who I really respect on building teams. They would just be super blatant to people. They would say, you know what, really what we're asking you to do is a volunteer job. We're asking you to put in huge time through this volunteer role. And in fact, it's kind of like working part-time for the church, but we're just not going to pay you. This role is going to require 10 hours a week of you. Don't say no for your people. And then regularly celebrate volunteers. If you're trying to build engagement, you need to increase the volunteer celebration. What gets celebrated gets repeated. What can you do to celebrate your volunteers this year at your church? All right, number 6, staffing needs continue to shift. So let me get a drink here. As we're going through these insights, I'm getting parched. So staffing needs are shifting. So we asked what roles were you hiring? And we saw a huge jump this year in support roles. So 45.42% of churches said they're hiring in support roles. So this would be like administration, non-frontline pastoral care roles. And 32% said they've got next gen in there. So interesting. These are kind of the two leading areas. So this is positive in one sense. I think this actually relates in a positive way to what was happening there before. Hiring support staff to support your pastors and directors can be a really good thing. Positive. That's really good. But my caution for you is this. Listen very carefully to me, friends. If you are hiring support roles in 2024, please make sure that you're not taking stuff away from volunteers, but your Ephesians 4, you're still equipping the saints. Even if it's a support role, they should be engaging more volunteers, not taking jobs away from volunteers. There needs to be a flow of work from your staff to volunteers, not the other way around. If you're hiring a support role if you're hiring support role to do things that used to be done by volunteers, I would be highly concerned about that. That's actually the start of decline of your church. This is one of the ways that churches become overstaffed. So I would audit your staff structure and ask the question, hey, what are some areas that we could give to volunteers? And could we lump a bunch of that together? What if we lumped a bunch of that work together and hired a staff to ultimately empower volunteers to pick up that work? So we again move from staff to volunteers. That's really what we're trying to do. So it's okay if we're hiring support staff. I think that's a good thing. It relates to the thing before it. Next gen, man, perfect area to invest. Kids ministry grows churches, and having a thriving kids ministry sometimes requires more staff to support the volunteers that are there. And so it makes sense that people are hiring in that area. Number 7, so top areas of concern. So these is when we asked people things that they're worrying about. Financial stability, 35% of people said financial stability. Staffing, 25% of people, when we asked them, this is an open forum question, 25% said something around staffing, 20% said something around facilities. So we have heard you clearly at Unseminary. We're going to be doing more on financial stability this year. We know that inflation is a real issue. We know that dealing with growth is a real issue, and donor fatigue is an issue. I'll give you an example. I don't know if you know this, but actually I do coaching with churches around, this is literally the first time I've ever talked publicly about this. I do coaching with churches around giving stuff. And in fact, just recently, I'm working through a public campaign phase where we're raising some resources for a church, and they had the largest, on the second weekend of their public phase of their campaign, they had the largest attendance ever in the history of their church during a capital campaign or during a fundraising campaign, a generosity initiative. And that's the trend we see time and again when done well. These are not contrary ideas. You can both raise resources and continue to reach people. I would say the big takeaway on financial stability is, the best time to grow, the best time to plant an oak tree was 30 years ago. The best time to put systems in place on this was 5 years ago. but the next best time to plant an oak tree is today. The next best time to start the systems required to build financial stability is today. So I would be thinking, what can you do today to build a system to not solve this quarter's financial problem, but to really change the trajectory of this over 2025 into 2026 and beyond. So that's it. 7 insights. Looking back to this survey over the last 20 years, it doesn't feels like 20 years, since 2020, a couple things that are interesting to see some health. So, hybrid worship adoption grew. You can see the number there. It actually was high in 2020 and then took a bit of a dip, but we've seen this to go back in there. Financial health. We're seeing great, financial health is just expanding, which is wonderful. Many churches are saying, hey, their financial health is better now than it was at the beginning of the year. And our staff's hope grew. Why do I say this? I really want to say for you and for me, the pandemic's behind us. I know, why are we still talking about the pandemic? But I really think many of us, we would say that's a defining turn in our history, but it's been 5 years since that, and it's time for us to move on. So friends, there it is. There are some insights from the 2024 National Executive Pastor Survey. I'd love for you to listen to the Unseminary podcast. Drop by. We'll put links in the show notes here about that. Drop by and subscribe to that. You can also drop by unseminary.com and sign up to our email list. We've got lots of ways to help executive pastors over there. Thanks so much for being a part of the survey. If you were, I'd love to comment below. Which of those insights resonate with you? How could they help? Or, what does that tweak you to think about for this coming year at your church? Thanks, friends.